in medieval times to a general audience. Popular consciousness is rife with misconceptions and myths about medieval times, owing to inertia in the school system, peer education, or just plain laziness. However, our mission needs time and effort to bring about. We're only students not even in medieval studies, but we have great passion towards this interesting and often misunderstood time period. We ask only for the smallest support from our audience. One may find links to our Ko-Fi page and our merchandise store in the description below. Throughout the 12th century, liquid money increased in circulation as medieval Europe faced economic and population expansion. Society also saw increased commerce and trade, in what medievalists call the commercial revolution of the Middle Ages. These changes led to, among other things, disputes over land, more land clearances, and a growing land market. While the old understanding of medieval times focused on customary land grants, called fiefs, new studies focused more on freeholds among so-called commoners. Those in certain fields, like soldiers, merchants, and legal professionals, among many others, were able to gain enough wealth and play with holding properties, hoping to gain from future price increases. In England especially, the land market became mature enough that financial speculation and investment became real activities in the Middle Ages. Many transactions tell of lands changing hands many times in their past owners' hopes that values would rise, and they could gain from price movements. Even mere peasants held entire portfolios of land assets while coping with risk as the land market ebbed and flowed every day. Financial activity regarding land and property rose so much that one could argue that the very first real estate bubble happened in medieval England. But how did medievalists discover this bubble? Fortunately for them, the 12th century's aftermath led to increased record keeping among administrators. A wealth of data thus exists for medieval economic historians to analyze and draw conclusions from. England especially remained relatively free from disorder, barring events like the Peasant Revolt or the Wars of the Roses. Record keeping remained robust over centuries, allowing medievalists to glimpse what had happened in this time. Our first dataset concerns fines collected from English counties. Exactly 24,395 fines were recorded here. These fines concerned lawsuits and legal disputes over freehold properties dealt with English common law. While debated over and ignored for economic analyses for decades over many issues, medievalists now agree that these fines help estimate how the medieval English valued lands. Another 92,652 records deal with buyer and seller information, like names, roles, and sometimes relationships to other people. Many transactions also recorded regional origins and occupations. While the number of records is evenly divided into buyers and sellers, there is a clear sex imbalance, with 70% of the litigants males. Under primogeniture, all property was inherited by the eldest male heir. If there were no male heirs, it was divided equally among the daughters. On marriage, a woman's property went to the husband. However, the husband needed his wife's consent to sell these properties, and upon his death, the wife took 1/3 of his lands. Thus, in more than 80% of recorded instances of women in the fines, they were selling property rather than buying it. In most cases, women were involved in transacting property with their husbands, although some instances exist where unmarried women perform property sales, either alone or in partnership with relatives or unrelated parties. Moving on, Information on regional origins come mostly from the 14th century, in just over a third of cases. Meanwhile, they appear in only 10% of the finds in the 15th century. This happened with rising geographical mobility, making place of origin a less useful method of identification. On the flip side, information on status and occupation appears more frequently over time. Before 1350, they appeared in only 7% of transactions. By the second half of the 15th century, they appeared in 20% of all records. These changes went with increasing division of labor and the growth of new occupations in England. Status information is also more frequently recorded with buyers than sellers, since they needed more ways to prove their claims in future disputes. The graph shown compares annual monetary finds with annual grain prices over 2 centuries. The first conclusion that one may draw is how market activity peaked in the 14th century, as shown from how many lawsuits happened in that time. Noticeably, finds increased after both the Great Famine and the Black Death, pointing to increased market activity after both calamities. In fact, a correlation is apparent between the average grain prices and market activity. More explicit transaction data shows how valuations were assigned according to the holder's expected annual profits. Thus, property was considered an asset class, and a fair price to pay would be based on discounted cash flows expected. In the mid-13th century, prices equated roughly to 10 years annual value, rising to 20 years by the mid-15th century. These, however, were only the average prices. Considerable variance existed in reality. In the early 14th century, prices were recorded that could be 15 or even 30 times the sworn annual value. After the Black Death, however, the highest recorded land prices were only 10 times the sworn annual value. By the 15th century, prices could be as low as 1 to 5 times annual value throughout the period, but by century's end, prices as high as 100 times annual value are recorded. One easily notices a trend. The ratio of annual value to price rises over years, indicating an increase in the value of property. Our next dataset concerns the relationship between average value of consideration and size of property. A consideration refers only to the sum paid for property titles. Estimating the relationship between the annual average change in payment and the total amount of land traded in acres suggests that the plot size and price were positively correlated in the 14th century. This correlation weakened, however, after 1350. No correlation exists in the first half of the 15th century, but a strong positive correlation appears between plot size and price after 1450. This evidence shows that prices rose in proportion to the amount of land traded over the period. The only exception was the first half of the 15th century, when prices kept rising while the amount of land traded remained static. Medieval economic historians Adrian Bell, Chris Brooks, and Helen Killick proceed with more rigorous statistical analysis of whether a real estate bubble existed in medieval England. They use data over 192 years, from 1308 to 1492. These contain annual prices for land, whether agricultural or residential, and their respective intrinsic values based on revenues. Residential lands' valuations were measured in rents, while agricultural ones were measured in wool and grain. These valuations were then compared with annual prices, using a statistical test for measuring economic bubbles created by Huntley Scheller and Simon van Noorden. For residential lands, the tests gave only weak indication that a bubble had formed. However, results for agricultural lands showed strong indications that bubbles had formed. They suggest that when a bubble has developed and is present in the actual value of the series, it propels financial returns upwards. This happens since investors receive compensation for the increasing probability of a bubble popping by even higher returns. When the bubble does pop, however, prices fall more the greater market prices are over intrinsic values. One easily observes three notable bubbles in medieval English agricultural lands. The first happened from 1383 to 1394, during the Hundred Years' War. This was only a coincidence, however, for nothing suggests that King Richard II's campaigns in France, Scotland, and Ireland would do anything to drive up land prices. A better explanation for this first bubble would be the rise in English cloth industry. Many profited from overseas trade, and these profits were invested into land speculation. The second bubble, from 1414 to 1425, was also coincidental with Henry V's invasion of Normandy and victory in Agincourt. This bubble is better explained by restrictions from the land market caused by currency shortages. While silver was the main coinage, it had become increasingly scarce, such that in 1420, gold coinage became advantageous to own. The land market thus became closed to London residents. However, they had more access to credit and merchant networks that let them access gold. These would gain them better positions in land speculation. In fact, this second bubble popped after Henry V re-established the Calais coin mint in 1422. Market activity resurged, and land prices returned to normal. The last bubble in medieval English agricultural lands happened in the 1470s. These happened after a slump in the 1450s and 1460s, when England experienced currency shortages and subsequent deflation. The population also stagnated, and overseas trade had fallen. After King Edward IV was restored to the throne in 1471, peace and political stability led to increased land speculation and investment. This bubble popped with Edward's death in 1483, after which the Wars of the Roses resumed. Et semper rememorator, non omnes vagantes aberarunt.